One king abandoned the throne for love, the other inherited it like a sentence he had spent his life fearing. In December 1936, Edward VIII chose Wallis Simpson over the British monarchy, turning a private romance into a constitutional crisis. His younger brother Albert, shy, dutiful, and never raised to expect the throne, became George VI almost overnight. And behind both men was the same mother, Queen Mary of Teck. To the world, she was the iron custodian of royal duty, a woman who believed the crown had to survive embarrassment, grief, and desire. But inside the family, that devotion left a fracture. The sin trained to inherit walked away. The son who stayed carried the burden under visible strain. Not because one mother caused every later wound, but because a documented pressure began much earlier, in the childhood Edward and Albert shared under Queen Mary. If the crisis exploded in 1936, what began behind the nursery door? So the nursery door is not just a symbol, it is the first place where the public crisis becomes traceable. The evidence comes in 3 layers. First, events on the record: births, households, dismissals, marriages, abdication, succession. Second, testimony in memoirs, diaries, letters, and royal biographies, valuable but shaped by memory, loyalty, embarrassment, and grief. Third, interpretation, asking how a childhood organized around duty may have affected 2 very different men. The question is not whether Queen Mary alone broke Edward and Albert. Families do not work that simply. Monarchies work even less simply. George V's severity mattered. Class rules mattered. Religion, divorce law, politics, public opinion, and the machinery of the crown all mattered. Still, the pattern is hard to ignore. Mary's eldest son later searched for private devotion so intensely that he gave up the throne. Her second son accepted the throne as duty and carried it under strain everyone could see. To understand that pattern without turning Mary into a caricature, we have to move backward to the world that trained her to believe survival meant restraint. Before Mary shaped 2 future kings, that world shaped her. She was born Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, close enough to the British royal family to understand its rituals, but not secure enough to take status for granted. Her parents moved within aristocratic circles, yet their finances were often strained. Mary grew up knowing that rank could look solid from the outside while feeling fragile inside. The lesson she absorbed was not that royalty should be emotionally fulfilled. It was that royalty must be controlled. Posture, dress, speech, correspondence, precedence, and marriage were not decorative details. They were the visible rules of survival. When Mary was drawn into the direct line of succession, first as the intended bride of Prince Albert Victor, and then, after his death, as the wife of his younger brother George, she became part of a dynastic repair. The monarchy needed continuity, the family needed acceptable heirs, the public needed order. Mary proved exceptionally good at that world. Biographers describe a woman with a powerful sense of duty, reverence for protocol, and discomfort with emotional display. She preserved objects, letters, jewels, precedents, and ceremony with almost archival discipline. To her, these things were scaffolding. So when Edward and Albert were born, they entered a household where affection passed through rank, schedule, and restraint. Mary's reserve was not unusual for her class and era, but for 2 small boys it became the atmosphere they breathed. Then those values became architecture. Rooms, routines, staff hierarchies, closed nursery doors. Those closed nursery doors mattered because inside them childhood ran through a chain of command. Edward, known inside the family as David, and his younger brother Albert, known as Bertie, woke up as royal children inside a managed institution. Their meals, walks, lessons, clothes, illnesses, punishments, and appearances before their parents passed through nursery staff first. In that world, a nanny was not just a helper, She was the daily authority between child and parent. She decided what was reported, softened, hidden, and when a boy was presentable enough to be brought downstairs. Affector, if it came, arrived by appointment. That distance was not Mary's invention alone. George, the boy's father, brought his own severity into the household. Later accounts describe him as demanding and intimidating, shaped by naval discipline and by the belief that sons were to be hardened, corrected, and prepared. Tenderness could look like weakness. Fear could be mistaken for respect. Mary's detachment and George's sternness worked together. One parent made emotional restraint feel proper, the other made obedience feel urgent. Between them stood the staff, translating family life into routine. For Edward, every gesture pointed toward kingship. For Bertie, the expectation was different, but not softer. He still had to be controlled and made acceptable to the same royal standard. That is why the nursery matters. If a child cried, someone decided whether the parent saw it. If a child was frightened, someone decided whether it counted. Once care is filtered through rank, schedule, and reputation, the dangerous question is simple. What could the system fail to notice? Then, in the late 1890s, the abstract system turns concrete. Biographical accounts of the royal nursery describe a head nanny whose conduct toward the two eldest boys was harmful, not merely strict. Edward, the firstborn, was reportedly neglected by her. Albert, Bertie, received the sharper treatment. The most disturbing detail repeated in accounts is that before the children were taken to see their parents, the nanny would pinch Albert so that he arrived crying. In an ordinary family room, a crying child might have drawn questions. In this nursery, it could produce the opposite result. A distressed little prince was inconvenient and out of place in the brief formal encounter with his parents. He could be sent back. The visit ended. The adult who controlled access kept control. That is the mechanism the biographies point to. Not a secret order from Mary. Not evidence that she arranged cruelty. The evidence points to something colder. A household in which the parents' distance gave a staff member room to shape what the parents saw. The abuse was eventually discovered, and the nanny was dismissed around 1897. But by then, according to these accounts, the arrangement had lasted long enough to leave a mark. The future Edward VIII had learned early that attention could be withheld. The future George VI had learned that fear and duty could arrive together just before he was presented to the people who should have been safest. A childhood incident does not explain an entire life by itself. It does not turn adult choices into automatic consequences. But it gives us the strongest concrete evidence of the system we have been tracing. Royal order on the surface, injury beneath it, and parents close enough in rank to command the nursery, yet far enough in practice to miss what was happening inside it. From here, the investigation follows what that emotional distance may have taught Mary's sons to seek, avoid, and fear. The first son to carry that lesson into history was Edward, the heir who would one day choose private devotion over the crown itself. Edward carried that lesson into adulthood long before Wallis Simpson entered the story. As Prince of Wales, he was adored in public, photographed, cheered, followed through tours of the empire. But the private record suggests a man who did not simply enjoy attention. He seemed to hunger for a kind of loyalty the crown could never return. In A King's Story, his own memoir, Edward writes about his mother with respect, even admiration, but not ease. Mary appears as grand, disciplined, almost ceremonial, a figure of majesty more than warmth. That matters because Edward himself chooses the language. He does not describe a home full of casual tenderness. He describes form, rank, and distance. Biographers have often read his later attachments against that absence. Not as a neat equation, lonely child equals abdication, but as a pattern. Edward was drawn to women who seemed to offer intense personal devotion, private refuge, and emotional priority over public expectation. Wallis Simpson did not create that need. She became the person around whom it hardened into a crisis. By 1936, the problem was no longer private. Edward was king, head of the Church of England, and expected to marry in a way the government, the dominions, and the public establishment could accept. Wallis was American, twice divorced, socially controversial, and politically alarming to many around the throne. The objections were constitutional, religious, class-bound, and personal at once. The abdication cannot honestly be reduced to Queen Mary, Wallis, or romance alone. But Edward's choice looks different beside the nursery evidence. Faced with a crown that demanded self-denial, he chose the promise of absolute personal loyalty. He chose the thing his childhood had trained him to seek, even if it meant giving up what he had been born to inherit. But the nursery did not produce only one rupture. Edward escaped the crown, and that escape dropped it onto the brother who had feared duty from the beginning. When Edward stepped away, the crown did not vanish. It landed on Bertie. Prince Albert, the second son, had not been raised as the central heir. He had been raised close enough to the throne to be disciplined by it, but not with the expectation that he would one day become its face. In childhood accounts, he appears as the more vulnerable brother, physically uncomfortable, tightly corrected, and remembered for the stammer that made speech itself a trial. That mattered because monarchy is performance as well as law. A king must open parliament, answer ministers, inspect troops, speak into microphones, and make hesitation look like steadiness. For Bertie, public duty pressed directly on the place where he was most exposed. He worked at it. He married Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, whose steadiness became one of the great supports of his life. He sought help for his speech. He faced the microphone not because it became easy, but because the institution required him to stand there anyway. Then, in December 1936, Edward's private decision became Bertie's public fate. The younger brother, who had not expected to be king, became George VI, inheriting a monarchy shaken by abdication, scandal, and distrust. The timing could hardly have been harsher. Within 3 years, Britain was at war. The king's careful, strained, unmistakably human voice became part of the national image of endurance. His vulnerability did not disappear behind the crown. It was absorbed into it. The evidence must stay careful here. George VI's later health decline is often discussed alongside stress, heavy smoking, wartime pressure, and the demands of kingship. But stress is context, not a single proven cause, and Queen Mary's emotional distance cannot be turned into a medical verdict. What can be said is narrower and stronger. The abdication forced Bertie into the exact machinery of duty he had spent his life learning to survive. Edward escaped the crown by choosing personal loyalty over royal obligation. Bertie stayed and made royal obligation visible in his body, his voice, and his reign. With both brothers in view, the question shifts back to their mother. Was this simply Mary's personal coldness? Or was she enforcing something larger than herself? That makes Mary harder to judge, not easier. Once the evidence widens beyond Edward and Bertie, her coldness begins to look less like a private defect and more like the human face of a royal operating system. The clearest example comes through neither heir, but through their youngest brother, Prince John. John suffered from epilepsy, a condition far less understood in the early 20th century than it is now. In his later years, he lived largely at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, away from the central machinery of court life, with attendants and a quieter routine. That arrangement should not be turned into a murder mystery or proof that he was erased out of simple cruelty. Medical practice, social stigma, and aristocratic ideas about disability all mattered. But it reveals the family logic with unusual clarity. Vulnerability was managed by distance. Illness was moved out of sight. Pain was made orderly. When John died in 1919, Queen Mary's diary reportedly described his death as a great release for the child and for the family. Read coldly, the phrase sounds brutal. In the language of Mary's world, it is more complicated. Grief forced through discipline, maternal feeling translated into stoic administrative form. This is the turn. Mary did not have to be a villain for real damage to occur. She only had to believe, deeply and consistently, that the crown survived through control, restraint, and the suppression of weakness. And she was not alone. The monarchy around her rewarded the same instincts: compose the portrait, close the nursery door, remove the difficult body from public view, keep the family image intact. But weakness did not disappear. It moved forward. From the nursery to Wood Farm to the microphones of 1936, until the private management of vulnerability collided with a public crisis the crown could no longer contain. By the end, the family tree stops looking only like a line of succession. It starts looking like a chain of consequence. Queen Mary gave her life to the monarchy. She mastered its rituals, guarded its image, and treated duty as the highest form of love she knew how to offer. The tragedy is that the same devotion may have injured the heirs it was meant to prepare. Edward, the adored public prince, reached the throne and chose a private attachment over kingship. Bertie, the anxious younger son, took the crown he had never expected and carried it through fear, speech, war, and exhaustion. One stepped away from duty, one submitted to it. Neither emerged untouched. The evidence does not let us see perfectly into Mary's heart. It does show a pattern: emotional distance, staff-filtered childhood, pressure disguised as discipline, and vulnerability managed out of sight. So the story is not that one cold mother single-handedly broke the Windsor dynasty. It is more unsettling than that. A royal system built to protect the crown helped wound the children who had to wear it. The crown survived, the children paid. For more royal history told through power, betrayal, and consequence, subscribe to Palace Scandals.